The year is 1989. A fleet is sailing across international waters. 17 diesel-powered submarines, 1 guided missile cruiser, 1 frigate, 1 destroyer. This is not a small force. This is a functional naval armada, enough firepower to threaten coastal cities, enough strategic value to shift the balance of power in regional conflicts. So which nation controls this fleet? The United States? China? The United Kingdom? None of them. This fleet belongs to a company that sells sugary carbonated water, Pepsi Cola. For a brief moment in '89, PepsiCo owned the 6th largest submarine fleet in the world, larger than most NATO countries. And the reason they owned it was not because they wanted to start a war. It was because the currency of a superpower had become so worthless that the only way the Soviet Union could pay for soda was by trading military hardware. This is not a feel-good business success story. This is a financial horror story. And it reveals something fundamental about what happens when a currency dies. When trust in money collapses, even the most powerful empires on Earth are forced to return to the oldest economic system in human history: barter. Trading physical goods for physical goods because paper promises mean nothing. By the end of this video, you will understand how a soda company became an arms dealer, why the Soviet ruble was worthless outside Soviet borders, and what this bizarre chapter of history teaches us about the fragility of fiat currency and the inevitable collapse of empires built on unstable money. Let me take you back to Moscow, 1959. The American National Exhibition, a Cold War propaganda showcase where the United States and the Soviet Union compete to prove whose system is superior. Capitalism versus communism, consumerism versus central planning. And in the middle of this ideological battlefield, there is a Pepsi booth. Vice President Richard Nixon is touring the exhibition with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. They are engaged in the famous kitchen debate, arguing about the merits of their respective systems. And, in a carefully orchestrated publicity stunt, Pepsi CEO Donald Kendall hands Khrushchev a cup of Pepsi. Cameras flash. The image goes global. The leader of the Soviet Union tasting American capitalism in liquid form. Khrushchev drinks it. And he likes it. This moment is not just a photo opportunity. This is the beginning of Pepsi's entry into the Soviet market. And it will lead to one of the strangest business deals in history. But there is a problem. A massive problem. The Soviet ruble. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union operates a closed economy. The ruble is not a freely traded currency. You cannot walk into a bank in New York or London and exchange rubles for dollars or pounds. The ruble has no value outside Soviet borders. Economists call this a blocked currency or a non-convertible currency. It only exists within the Soviet system. And because the Soviet government controls all pricing, all production, and all distribution, the ruble is not a market currency. It is an accounting unit, a token that represents state allocation of resources. So if Pepsi wants to sell soda in the Soviet Union, they face an impossible question. How do you get paid in a currency that has no value outside the country you are doing business in? The answer is barter, the oldest form of trade in human history. You give me something I want. I give you something you want. No money involved. And this is exactly what Pepsi does. In 1972, Pepsi strikes a deal with the Soviet government. Pepsi will provide soda concentrate to Soviet bottling plants. In exchange, the Soviets will give Pepsi Stolichnaya vodka. Pepsi will then take that vodka back to the United States, sell it through a distribution network, and convert the vodka into dollars. This is liquid for liquid, soda syrup for alcohol. It sounds absurd, but it works. Pepsi becomes the first American consumer product sold in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets get their soda. Everyone wins, for a while. But by the mid-1980s, the deal has a new problem. The Soviet people love Pepsi. Demand is exploding. The vodka trade is no longer enough to cover the cost of the soda concentrate Pepsi is providing. The Soviets need to scale up, but they still cannot pay in rubles. And they do not have enough vodka to trade, so they offer something else. Ships, specifically decommissioned military vessels. In 1989, PepsiCo and the Soviet government sign a new agreement. It is worth $3 billion over 10 years. It is one of the largest trade deals between an American company and the Soviet Union. And the payment terms are insane. The Soviets will provide Pepsi with 17 diesel-electric submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. These are not museum pieces. These are functional warships. Granted, they are older models being retired from active service, but they are still military-grade hardware, the kind of assets that nations use to project power and defend their interests. Pepsi does not want a navy. They are a beverage company. But they accept the deal because the ships have scrap value. Pepsi plans to sell the vessels to a shipbreaking company in Sweden, which will dismantle them and sell the metal. The submarines and warships will be turned into steel and sold on the international commodities market. The Soviets get their Pepsi. Pepsi gets metal. And for a brief moment, Pepsi owns more submarines than Canada, Australia, or most of NATO. Donald Kendall, the Pepsi CEO who orchestrated this deal, reportedly told the U.S. National Security Advisor, We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are. It was a joke, but it was also true. Think about what this means. A superpower, a nation with nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and one of the largest armies on Earth, is trading its military hardware for soda. Not because it wants to, because it has to, because its currency is worthless, because the ruble cannot buy anything outside Soviet borders, because the only thing the Soviet Union has that the rest of the world wants is physical goods, vodka, oil, ships, anything that can be touched, moved, and sold. This is what happens when a fiat currency loses credibility. When people stop believing in the paper becomes worthless. And the only things that retain value are tangible assets, hard assets, things that exist in the physical world and cannot be printed, devalued, or inflated away. But the story does not end with ships and submarines. Because in 1990, Pepsi and the Soviet Union sign an even bigger deal, the largest trade agreement in Soviet history, $3 billion. This time, the Soviets will not just provide ships, they will build oil tankers specifically for Pepsi, brand new vessels that Pepsi can lease or sell on the global market. The Soviets will also provide more vodka, more ships, and expanded access to Soviet bottling operations. Pepsi will set up restaurants. They will open Pizza Hut franchises across the Soviet Union. This is not just soda anymore. This is a full-scale economic partnership. And then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. It dissolves. The country ceases to exist. The government Pepsi signed the deal with no longer exists. The contracts are void. The assets are scattered across 15 newly independent nations. The ships are in Ukraine. The bottling plants are in Russia. The oil tankers that were supposed to be built never get finished. The rubles Pepsi was supposed to receive are now the currency of a dead state. Pepsi lost billions. The $3 billion deal evaporated. The ships they were promised either stayed in port, were claimed by the new governments, or were sold off by officials looking to pocket cash in the chaos. The contracts meant nothing because the entity that signed them no longer existed. This is the lesson Pepsi learned the hard way. Political risk is real. When you do business with a state, you are betting on the stability of that state. And when that state collapses, your contracts, your agreements, and your legal protections collapse with it. The Soviet Union disintegrated in less than 900 days. One of the most powerful empires in human history went from superpower to fractured republics in under 3 years. And when it fell, it did not fall because of a military invasion. It fell because its economy could not function, because central planning created inefficiency, because the ruble had no real value, because the entire system was built on a foundation of lies, subsidies, and forced labor that could not compete with market economies. And in the rubble of that collapse, Pepsi was left holding contracts with a ghost. The warships they had accepted as payment, sold for scrap, dismantled in Swedish shipyards and melted down into raw steel. The submarines that briefly made Pepsi the sixth largest naval power on Earth were turned into rebar, car parts, and construction materials. The Soviets did not trade destroyers for soda because they thought it was a good idea. They did it because they had no other option. Their currency was dead. Their economy was collapsing. And the only way to access Western goods was to trade the physical assets they still controlled. This is what desperation looks like at the nation-state level. Now, before you dismiss this as a Cold War relic, a bizarre footnote from a failed socialist experiment, ask yourself this question. Could this happen again? Could a modern currency collapse so completely that nations are forced to trade physical assets instead of money? The answer is yes, because the mechanics have not changed. Fiat currency is only valuable as long as people trust it. The moment that trust breaks, the currency dies. And when the currency dies, people revert to barter, to gold, to commodities, to anything that holds intrinsic value. This has happened throughout history. In Weimar Germany, people traded wheelbarrows full of marks for a loaf of bread. In Zimbabwe, the currency became so worthless that trillion-dollar bills could not buy groceries. In Venezuela, people stopped using bolivars and started trading in goods, gold, and foreign currency. And in the Soviet Union, a superpower traded warships for Pepsi. The common thread in all of these collapses is the same. The currency was backed by nothing except government decree. And when the government lost credibility, the currency lost value. Instantly, completely, irreversibly. This is why hard assets matter. Physical gold, real estate, commodities, oil, machines, ships. These things do not depend on a government's promise. They have value because they are useful, because they can be touched, moved, and traded. When paper money fails, hard assets survive. Pepsi understood this. That is why they accepted ships instead of rubles. They knew the rubles were worthless. But the ships, even as scrap metal, had value. The submarines could be melted down and sold. The steel was real. The ruble was not. So what is the lesson for you? The next time you look at the cash in your wallet, remember Pepsi. That money is only valuable because people believe it is valuable, because the government says it is legal tender, because the system that backs it is still functioning. But if that system collapses, if trust breaks, If the state that issues the currency ceases to exist, then your paper money becomes exactly what it is, paper. And when that happens, the only things that will have value are the things you can hold, the things you can trade, the things that exist outside the financial system. Just like the Soviets discovered in 1989 when they traded destroyers for soda, because their money had died. The Pepsi Navy is not a business triumph. It is a warning, a reminder that empires do not fall on battlefields. They fall on balance sheets. And when they do, the people left holding paper are the ones who lose everything. Here's what I want you to do. Go to the comments right now. If the dollar or the euro collapsed tomorrow, what do you think companies would accept as payment? Would Apple trade iPhones for oil? Would Amazon take gold instead of credit cards? Write one word: barter or chaos. Let me know what you think would happen. And if this video changed how you see money, share it with someone who still thinks their savings account is safe just because the number on the screen looks big.